We heard the American commander there in Anna's piece refer to the need for a free and open Indo-Pacific. What's that a reference to? Why do we keep hearing this? Well, it's the South China Sea, which China claims now as these rocky outposts as its own territory, but of course the rest of the world disputes. But it's also the South Pacific as well. And Australia, certainly under Scott Morrison since he became Prime Minister, has been engaged in what's been called the Pacific Step-Up, to remind many of our neighbours in the Pacific that Australia is its best friend, that we're engaged with them and we're going to spend more on their development as well, and that's certainly been happening. But there's also a great strategic competition going on in the South Pacific as well, and China, we know, has been involved in a lot of, diplomacy and funding of infrastructure in the Pacific too. Part of this also folds into its so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which countries like Australia have been wary of. Yes, willing to cooperate with some of these big infrastructure projects, but also not willing to be a formal part of this Belt and Road Initiative, which some say is about China just extending its global reach through these infrastructure programs. There's been a quote too from the Chinese Defence Minister in the last 24 hours or so in Beijing, talking to some Pacific nations. That's raised a bit of concern, linking for the first time the Belt and Road Initiative to China's military aims. He says cooperation will be promoted in such areas as anti-terrorism, peacekeeping and disaster relief to strengthen exchanges and cooperation under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, no one's going to argue about Chinese military help for disaster relief and peacekeeping and so on, but if it does mean an excuse for China investing in building up military bases and a military presence in the Pacific, well, that's another thing. I want to go to Dr. Bates-Gill. He's an expert in Chinese foreign policy at Macquarie University. Thanks very much for joining me this afternoon. Should we be concerned at all about this sort of comment from China's Defence Minister?
Yes and no, and I think mostly not too much. I think we need to take a deep breath here. Yes, it is a first to see such explicit connection between the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese military-related activities, so that's a concern. But to be very honest, such a senior-ranking official speaking before foreigners, not to mention the Belt and Road Initiative, would be also quite an odd thing. And as you just noted, some of the activities he's talking about, anti-terrorism work, disaster relief, and the like, these are things that all nations try to do with one another. Australia does similar activities with its neighbours in the region as well. So it bears watching. But I'm not sure it's something we need to be alarmed about just yet.
But, I mean, Australia does this as well. We talk about our naval presence in the Pacific being there to exercise in case of disaster relief needs. Should a tidal wave or a tsunami or some sort of cyclone damage one of our friends in the Pacific, we need to be prepared with, good access and operability in the region. We know, though, that that's not all it's about. If China is starting to develop a greater naval and Air Force presence in the South Pacific under the banner of disaster relief, should we believe that?
I think, as I say, this is definitely bears watching. We know already that China has made some, inroads, militarily speaking, trying to open up military-to-military relationships with countries in the region. There was some news a year or so ago that, that wasn't really fully confirmed that China was actually intending to build some sort of a naval base in one of the South Pacific island nations. So it definitely bears watching. I think the step up and other measures that Australia has taken, either unilaterally or sometimes bilaterally or trilaterally with other partners in the region to expand Australia's traditional security presence in the region is welcome and does send the right signal to China.
Let me ask you about the Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure program that reaches out well beyond its borders. Where is this at the moment? It seems a little opaque in terms of how much is being spent and what it's being spent on.
Well, it's a long story. The Belt and Road Initiative, as I suggested a little bit earlier, is as much a sort of slogan and ambition as it is a sort of geopolitical play and massive infrastructure scheme. So it's an important initiative. It's sort of the signature foreign policy initiative of the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, and that alone is going to mean that it's here to stay as long as he's around. So it's big, it's important, it's making major infrastructural development changes in countries that need that type of assistance. And along with it, of course, comes a diplomatic and economic influence in those countries. There's been a bit of a backlash. And I think going on in Beijing right now is a bit of reconsideration, a sort of one step back after two steps forward, to rethink how BRI is perceived. They know there's a backlash, not just among sort of Western liberal democracies, but even among developing countries that they're trying to help. So there's going to be some rethinking, but this is here to stay, and it's something we're going to have to be watching carefully.
Let me also get your thoughts on Hong Kong. With Carrie Lam yesterday in Hong Kong declaring this extradition bill is dead. It's not everything the protesters want. They want the words, it's withdrawn. But what would be going on in Beijing after what we've seen over the last month in Hong Kong, these mass protests succeeding largely? What would be the thinking right now amongst the Chinese leadership about what it all means?
Well, it's hard for me to believe that she would step forward and take that embarrassing step down without already having received some kind of blessing or support from Beijing that this was the right thing to do. Now, clearly, Beijing is keeping a relatively low profile on this, letting the blame fall on her and let her, rise and fall with it. But they are watching this with great scrutiny. You can be sure of that. This is a remarkably sustained campaign. It's sending a powerful signal, I think, to Beijing about the need for them to act much more cautiously if they're seeking to bring real changes of this type to the political system, legal system in Hong Kong. And I think it's a bit of a chastening moment, I think, in Beijing. And, so far, even this step by the executive Lam has still not really calmed the waters. And we're going to have to be watching this again very carefully, just as Beijing is.
Indeed, indeed. Dr. Bates-Gill, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate that.